You have seen it in the movies. A pilot is shot down and bails out. Once on the ground, desperate to make it back to his home air base, he attempts to steal an enemy aircraft. But that is just Hollywood, right? What if I told you that this exact thing would happen in World War II to an American pilot? This is the unbelievable story of Bruce Carr. Now, if you enjoy incredible war stories like this one, you will also probably enjoy this video's sponsor, Warpath. Warpath is an epic mobile military strategy game that puts you in command of an authentic wartime experience with realistic weapons, battlefields, and tactics. There are over 100 tank types, 34 types of artillery, and 64 different fighter aircraft. These include the P-51 Mustang, the legendary long-range Allied escort that protected the heavy bombers, and its common adversary, the deadly Messerschmitt Bf-109. Use all of these different vehicles and more on their realistic maps as you work through the detailed terrain and enemy defenses to try and push forward to victory. And this is where your strategy comes into play. Can you defend your base from unexpected assaults? Can you put together a plan to take over valuable positions? You won't know for sure until you are looking over the battlefield and sending your troops to war. So use the link below and go download this totally free military strategy game today and put your skills to the test. Thanks again to Warpath, and without further ado, enjoy. Bruce Carr was a native of New York and, after learning to fly at the age of 15, signed up for the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1942. After doing very well in training, he was sent overseas to Europe in early 1944, a few months before the Allied invasions at Normandy. He was assigned to the 363rd Fighter Group, one of the first units to be outfitted with the new P-51 Mustang. In his own training and previous flight hours, the young Carr had never before flown above 10,000 feet. But once in his Mustang for the first time, he would take it over 30,000 feet, and after this impressive experience, he famously gave his P-51 the name Angel's Playmate. Carr would go on to score his squadron's first kill in this fighter on March 8th of 1944, but he was actually not given credit for it. In this engagement, he would chase a Messerschmitt Bf-109 to within a few feet of the ground. The inexperienced American was not yet accurate with his firing, though, and sent tracers all around the German. Only one bullet would actually hit his target, but the German pilot apparently thought that he was doomed, and proceeded to bail out of the fighter at far too low of an altitude. His plane would crash into the ground and the pilot would be killed. Carr would thereafter try and claim it as a kill, stating that he had scared the German pilot to death, but he would not be given credit for this victory. Nonetheless, Carr would settle in and prove to be a very gifted pilot. He would take down his first official kill on June 17th, when he shot down a Focke-Wolf 190 a few weeks after D-Day. He would be promoted shortly after and would continue to show out. On a strafing mission a few months later in September, his flight would run into a large group of German fighters, where he would end up taking down 3 Focke-Wulfs in a single day. The following month, on October 29th, with the downing of a pair of Bf-109s, and would thus officially reach the status of an ace. But his success would quickly be brought to an abrupt halt. 4 days later, on the 2nd of November, he would begin a mission that would prove to be one of the most bizarre in history. As he and his flight embarked on yet another strafing mission, all was going well. The 363rd was attacking a German airfield in Czechoslovakia. They had participated in these ground attack missions many times and were wreaking havoc on German air defenses. But in this mission, German anti-aircraft fire was intense and sent a volley of fire that would land a direct hit on the famous Angel's Playmate. She would be severely damaged, forcing Bruce Carr to bail out of the aircraft. He would be able to successfully exit the fighter, but was deep behind enemy lines, and his outlook looked bleak at best. Unfortunately for Carr, he was over Czechoslovakia, which did not have quite as much of an organized civilian resistance when compared to some of the other areas like France. Thus, once he made it to the ground, he was on his own as he attempted to evade capture by the Germans and make it to some sort of friendly unit. He attempted to survive on his own, away from the cities and German soldiers, but after several days, he began to give in physically. He was starving, exhausted, and suffering from exposure to the elements. So the downed American eventually came to the conclusion that for his survival, he needed to turn himself over to the Germans. It was not the preferred outcome, but it looked like his last remaining option. And so, a few days after he was shot down, Bruce Carr attempted to walk to a German airfield and turn himself over as a prisoner of war. But fate would have other plans. As he walked up to the airbase, he saw from a distance that the grounds crew was in the process of arming and refueling a Focke-Wolf 190 near the runway. At that moment, like the modern-day Maverick, Bruce Carr was struck with a bold and risky idea. Rather than being taken prisoner, the American pilot thought that he might be able to steal the advanced German fighter and somehow fly it back to American lines. So, as he formulated his plan, he waited away from the airfield, watching the grounds crew finish their job. Once they had left the area, Carr hopped the fence and climbed into the cockpit of the fighter. He would spend the entire night inside the aircraft, trying to learn the controls and teach himself how to operate the plane. Then at dawn, as the sun began to peek over the treetops, he started the engine of the German fighter. The propeller began to spin and the aircraft began to move, rolling towards the runway. He punched the throttle up as there was no resistance at all. Most of the Germans at the base were either still asleep or oblivious to the fact that it was not a German pilot in the aircraft. It likely seemed like a completely normal sound as the Focke-Wolf began to roar and the engine came to life. It was an unbelievable story, and Carr no doubt cracked a smile as he felt the German aircraft leave the ground. His studying of the controls had paid off, despite his inability to read any German at all. This undertaking would have been an incredible challenge for any pilot. Many aircraft during this time had very different characteristics and tendencies on takeoff, so they each needed to be handled differently. But in Carr's situation, he only had one shot and had to get it right. But despite the odds of this grim situation, into the air this warbird flew. So, without so much as a peep, Carr took the aircraft off of the ground and began to fly, setting a course for friendly lines. For some time he flew, quietly watching for any friendly or enemy aircraft in the skies around him. He was likely not sure which he would dread seeing more, as he was flying with the Luftwaffe cross on his side. But without seeing any aircraft, he eventually made it to a friendly base where he was met with a grim situation. The American anti-aircraft crews saw the Focke-Wolf and immediately began to open fire, sending machine gun fire and flak all around his fighter. With a German radio, the American had no way to tell the crews on the ground that he was in fact a friendly pilot. And so, with no other option, he dropped down to treetop level, flying as low as he could to avoid being hit by the ground fire. Lacking a full understanding of the controls, he was not able to lower his landing gear, putting him in even more of a difficult spot. He had to get on the ground, however, and fast before American fighters were sent to intercept. So, with no other options, Bruce Carr lined up his nose with a nearby American airfield and brought the Focke-Wolf in. With no operational landing gear, he was forced to execute a belly landing. This was already no easy task, but was made even more challenging by the fact that he was in an aircraft that he was completely unfamiliar with. The skilled Bruce Carr, however, would pull it off. He set the plane down on the airfield, coming to a stop in the middle of the runway. Very quickly, American military police surrounded the aircraft at gunpoint, where Bruce Carr was actually unable to convince them that he was in fact American. Many of the soldiers initially thought that his story was not plausible and that he was likely a German spy sent to trick them. But fortunately, his group commander would soon arrive, telling the policemen that he recognized Carr and that he was indeed telling the truth. After this incredible endeavor, the American hero would be promoted to first lieutenant and would be sent on leave in the coming week. In the spring of 1945, after being hailed a hero in the States, Bruce Carr would return to the front and would continue fighting in his Mustang. He would shoot down several more German aircraft before the end of the war, bringing his total kill count to 15 confirmed victories. He would live to be 74 and would be the only pilot in history to leave for a mission in a P-51 Mustang and would return a few days late in a Focke-Wolf 190. Thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing.